Story number 1. The Whispering Road. The rain fell in thick sheets, pounding against the windshield as I drove through the darkened highway. My headlights barely pierced the wet haze ahead, and the wind wrenched the wipers back and forth, struggling to keep up. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, swallowing everything around it. It was one of those nights when the world seemed to blur, when even the sky felt like it was waiting for something. I hadn't seen another car in hours. I was alone, just the hum of the engine and the occasional scrape of tires against the soaked asphalt. But then, just as the rain seemed to swallow the road entirely, I saw the figure on the side of the highway. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were soaked through, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. He stood still, barely moving, as if the storm had made him part of the landscape. I slowed the car, the engine growling against the rain, and pulled over to the shoulder. Something about the way he stood there, waiting, felt wrong. Still, the road was empty, and I wasn't in the mood for isolation, so I cracked the window. "You need a ride?" I called out, my voice barely louder than the rain. The man didn't answer. Instead, he shifted slightly, his silhouette somehow darker against the stormy night. I could feel the air growing heavier, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. His gaze, or what I assumed was his gaze, remained fixed on me. Without a word, he opened the door and slid into the seat beside me. The car creaked with the weight of him, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled the air. I started driving again, unsure of why I had even picked him up. But there was something about him, something that felt inevitable. The rain pounded louder, and the only sound in the car was the faint hiss of the wipers and the slow, steady rumble of the engine. I glanced at him once, but his head was tilted down, the brim of his hat hiding his face completely. I could feel his presence like a pressure in the air, thick and suffocating. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. "How far are you going?" I asked instead, my voice feeling small in the stillness of the car. No answer. The silence seemed to press in from all sides, wrapping around me. The rain outside sounded distant now, as if it were being muffled by something. I glanced at the road ahead, but everything seemed off. The headlights should have been lighting up the pavement, but instead, the darkness seemed to stretch beyond the reach of the light. Time itself felt distorted. It wasn't just the weather or the hour, it was something deeper, something that gripped the air, pulling at the edges of my mind. Minutes passed, but the highway didn't seem to change. There were no signs, no exits, no landmarks. The road went on, an endless stretch of black asphalt under a pitch-black sky. The car seemed to be moving faster now, but it felt like we were standing still. The world outside the window looked unfamiliar, distorted, and the shadows seemed to shift in strange, impossible ways. I didn't know if I'd driven this far or if I'd been here forever. I turned to look at the man again. This time, he had moved, slightly, but enough to make me nervous. His head was still tilted down, but his hands were now resting on his lap, his fingers curled tightly, almost painfully, into fists. His breathing, though, was the worst of it. It was slow, deliberate, but not quite right. There was something cold about it, like the air itself was caught in his chest, held back from escaping. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me, but it was useless. The rain grew heavier, the windshield nearly obscured by sheets of water, and yet, in the reflection of the glass, I saw something else. Something moving. The shadows in the car had shifted, and I saw the faint outline of another figure, a shape, or maybe a presence, hovering just behind the man. The road seemed to stretch on forever. The hum of the tires against the wet pavement was a steady rhythm, but now it felt like the car was driving through thickening air, like we were pressing through something that wasn't quite real. The corners of my vision blurred, and when I blinked, I couldn't remember the last few miles. Time had begun to slip away, the journey erasing itself from my memory like it was never meant to be remembered. Each time I tried to focus on the present, the car seemed to shift forward, as if the road was deciding where it wanted to take us. And then I realized I couldn't even remember how I had picked him up or where I was going in the first place. I looked over at him once more, but now his face was visible. The hat had shifted slightly, and his eyes were empty, hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow everything in their gaze. I felt something cold curl around my chest, something crawling up my spine. The air inside the car had thickened, suffocating me, and the weight of his presence became unbearable. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. But he didn't answer. He didn't even move. And as the miles blurred by, the road finally opened up before us. Empty, endless, silent. And I knew, deep down, that I would never find my way back. The whispers had begun, and they were coming from the road itself. Story number 2. The Girl with Eyes Like Mirrors. The rain had settled into a steady, oppressive drizzle as I passed through the small, forgotten town. The streetlights were dim, flickering as if they too were weary of their own existence. I wasn't planning to stop, not really. The town was nothing more than a blip on the map, a place that seemed to be left behind by time itself. But when I saw her standing at the side of the road, the decision was made for me. She was young, too young for the way she stood there, a silhouette in the mist. Her long coat was soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. She didn't move when I slowed the car, just watched me with those eyes. Eyes that were like mirrors. I stopped, rolling down the window just a crack. "You need a ride?" I asked, though the words felt unnecessary the moment they left my mouth. There was something about her, something that made the air feel heavier, more alive. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and slid into the seat beside me. Her movements were fluid, unsettlingly smooth, as if she wasn't quite real. She didn't speak, and yet I could feel her presence, cold and solid, pressing against the space between us. The car felt smaller with her in it, the air more stifling. I drove in silence, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. Her gaze, though, was fixed on the window, or maybe on the darkness outside. The rain continued its relentless tap-tap against the glass, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had been on the road for hours, but the night felt endless. The town had already slipped behind us, swallowed by the dark. I could feel the weight of her silence growing heavier with each passing mile, but it wasn't until I glanced at her again that something shifted. Her eyes, those eyes like mirrors, were reflecting something. Not the road, not the rain, but faces. Faces of people who had been in the car before. People who had sat exactly where she sat now. I couldn't see them clearly, not enough to make them out, but they were there. Shadowed, distorted. Faces frozen in a moment of silent despair. And just as quickly the faces were gone, leaving only her reflection in the glass. I swallowed hard, my heart beating faster than it should. I tried to focus on the road, but the headlights seemed to bend around her, the edges of the night blurring in unnatural ways. The town had faded away, but somehow it felt like we were still driving through it, through its emptiness, through its endless waiting. "How far are you going?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the car. No answer. The silence pressed in, suffocating. I looked at her again, her eyes never leaving the window, and for the first time I noticed how still she was. how still everything around her seemed to be. The rain outside had slowed, but the world seemed to be holding its breath. I wanted to speak again, to ask more questions, but the words tangled in my throat. The air in the car felt thick, like it was soaking into my skin. And then, just as suddenly as the thought crossed my mind, I realized that I didn't remember the last few miles. The town had disappeared, but so had the road. We were driving in a place that didn't exist anymore. A place between where things had been and where they were going. The reflection in her eyes had changed. There were more faces now. Not just the ones I had glimpsed before, but clearer, more vivid. I saw their eyes, wide with fear, staring back at me from the glass. They were trapped in that moment, lost in a place that was neither here nor there. A place I had driven into without even realizing it. A place where time stopped, where the past and present twisted together like broken memories. I tried to slow the car, to stop it, but the steering wheel felt strange, like it was slipping out of my control. The road had stopped making sense. It wasn't long before I couldn't remember the way back, or where I had come from. I was still driving, but I had no idea where I was going. And then I understood. She wasn't a passenger. She was something else, something far older, far more patient than anything I had ever known. She had been here before, countless times. Her eyes had seen the faces of those who had come before me, those who had disappeared without a trace, their names forgotten, their stories lost to the same silence that now swallowed me whole. The girl with eyes like mirrors didn't speak, but I could hear her calling to the lost, to those who would never leave. And just as I realized this, I saw my own face in her eyes, cold, wide, and still, like all the others. And then, the world outside the car stopped moving. The rain, the road, the darkness, it all froze. And I was there with her, in that eternal stillness, trapped forever in the reflection of her eyes. Story number 3. The Silent Passenger. It was one of those nights when the road felt endless, stretching out under the moon like a dark scar that cut through the heart of nowhere. I had been driving for hours, the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt a constant companion. The kind of drive where time blurs, where the only thing that matters is the road ahead and the soft pulse of the engine beneath me. The radio had long since gone silent, its static melding with the quiet outside. I was on a back road, the kind that winds through nothing but trees and open fields, the kind that feels like it could disappear into itself if you drive far enough. The headlights carved thin lines through the night, but even they seemed to shy away from the shadows, leaving more of the world unseen than revealed. That's when I saw him, standing by the side of the road, still as a stone. A figure, tall and unnervingly thin, wrapped in a long coat that flapped gently in the wind. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. But his eyes, those eyes, pierced through the darkness. Hollow, empty, like two black holes that pulled at everything they gazed upon, and they were staring right at me. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. But something in me, something I couldn't explain, told me to stop. So, I did. The car groaned to a halt beside him, the engine sputtering briefly before settling into silence. I rolled down the window, the cool air rushing in with the smell of wet earth and decay. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness of the night. He didn't answer, just stood there, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence stretched between us like an open wound, raw and painful. I looked at him again, the uncertainty crawling up my spine. The wind picked up, but it didn't seem to touch him. He didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. I swallowed, trying to push the feeling away, the gnawing suspicion that something was wrong, something deeply wrong. But the night was too quiet, the road was too empty, and he was still standing there. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying again. But the words seemed to evaporate before they reached him. His face didn't change, his posture didn't shift, but I could feel his presence like a weight, like an anchor pulling at my chest. Finally, after what felt like forever, he slid into the passenger seat without a sound. The door clicked shut behind him, and the car seemed to grow colder, the air inside heavier. The silence between us thickened, pressing against my skin like it was made of something solid. I started the car again, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the wheel. The road stretched ahead, endless, black and empty. But the man, if he was even a man, sat still beside me, not a word passing his lips. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but I could feel him watching me, the weight of his gaze seeping into my bones. His hollow eyes never moved, never blinked, but I could feel them on me, burrowing into my thoughts, my fears. Every minute that passed felt like a lifetime. I wanted to scream, to ask him what he wanted, but the words caught in my throat. The road seemed to go on forever. No exits, no signs, just the black ribbon of pavement and the trees that pressed in from all sides like dark sentinels. The night didn't feel right. It wasn't the kind of quiet you find in the woods, the kind that settles over you like a blanket. This was the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl, the kind that was pregnant with something waiting, something that was about to happen. I glanced at him again, and for a split second I thought I saw something in his eyes. Not just emptiness, but something far darker, something that twisted the space around us. His eyes were black, but not in the way that people's eyes can be dark. They were voids, sucking the light around them, pulling at everything. The longer I looked, the harder it became to breathe. I jerked my head back to the road, my heart racing. The silence was suffocating. It felt like the kind of silence that comes just before the storm, like the moment before everything changes. "How far are we going?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. No response, not even a shift in his posture. He just sat there, his presence growing heavier, and I felt it then, the absolute stillness, like the world had stopped. The car moved forward, but the road didn't feel like it was leading anywhere anymore. It was as if we were floating, lost in a space between places, between time. The shadows stretched longer, folding in on themselves, and the headlights seemed to fade into nothing. The panic surged inside me. I reached for the door handle, ready to pull over, to stop this madness, but my hand wouldn't move. The air in the car had become thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. I was trapped in the silence with him. I glanced at him once more, my body trembling. His eyes were no longer just empty, they were deep wells of darkness, swallowing everything around us. He hadn't spoken a word, but I understood then. The silence wasn't an absence of sound, it was a warning. And as the car rolled on, I realized that I wasn't the one who had stopped. He had been waiting for me to ask the question, to break the silence. But the silence was the last sound I would ever hear. Story number 4. The Harvest. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of the truck's engine as it rumbled down the empty, desolate highway. The kind of night where the stars seem to hold their breath, where even the air feels heavy and reluctant to move. The road stretched out before me like a black vein, winding through fields of nothing. The kind of place where time itself seems to fade away, swallowed by the darkness. I was headed toward the next town, but I had no real destination. The hours on the road were endless, the truck's engine my only company. That was when I saw her. A figure on the side of the road, barely visible in the flickering headlights. She was standing still, her coat wrapped tightly around her, the fabric whipping in the wind. I didn't know why I slowed down, but I did. The truck groaned to a halt beside her, the tires skidding lightly on the wet pavement. The moment I stopped, I felt it. The air thickening, the weight of the night pressing closer. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair that hung like a curtain over her face. Her eyes, though, those eyes, they were wide and empty, the kind of eyes that had seen things you couldn't forget, things that would follow you long after the night ended. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice feeling too loud, too bright against the oppressive quiet of the night. She nodded without saying a word and climbed into the truck. The moment the door shut, the temperature inside dropped. I tried to ignore the sudden chill that crept over my skin, but it clung to me, a cold that I couldn't shake. I glanced at her, expecting her to speak, but she remained silent, staring ahead at the road. I started the engine again, the tires crunching as I pulled back onto the highway. The headlights flickered briefly, casting shadows across the barren fields on either side. The night felt deeper now, more suffocating, as if we were drifting further away from everything familiar. I didn't know how long we drove in silence, but the stillness between us began to feel unnatural, as if the world outside the truck had been forgotten. That was when she spoke, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I've seen them," she said, her words trailing off as if she wasn't entirely sure what she was saying. "In the fields, at night, when the harvest comes." I glanced at her, my grip tightening on the wheel. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness outside, but there was something in her voice, something that pulled at the edges of my mind. I didn't know what she meant, but I felt the words lodge themselves somewhere deep inside me, a warning I couldn't yet understand. "The harvest," she repeated, her voice quieter now. "It comes when the night is at its darkest, when the moon is hidden. They wait in the fields, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the ones who wander too close." I wanted to ask her what she was talking about, but I couldn't. Something in the air had shifted, the weight of her words hanging between us like a thread, pulling me deeper into the darkness. "They come for the ones who don't belong," she whispered. "They take them into the earth, the ones who are lost, the ones who don't know the way." I felt the truck jolt slightly, and for a moment the headlights flickered again, casting strange, elongated shadows across the fields. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement. Figures standing just beyond the reach of the light, watching us. "They take them, and they wait for more," she continued, her voice now colder, more distant. "The harvest isn't just for the living, it's for the lost, the ones who are forgotten. They call to them in the dark, they wait, and they whisper." Her words chilled me to the bone, and for the first time, I felt the weight of the night pressing against the truck, the dark fields closing in around us. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice strained, though I already knew, deep down. I didn't want to know. She turned to me then, her eyes meeting mine for the first time, and I saw them. Those eyes that were not just empty, but hollow, like deep wells, endless and dark, pulling at everything around them. Her gaze seemed to reach into me, pulling out thoughts I hadn't known I had, fears I hadn't known existed. "It's the ritual," she said, her voice low, trembling. "It calls to you, even when you don't hear it. The harvest comes for those who wander into the dark, the ones who are lost, the ones who have no place to be. It comes for them, and when it does, it takes them into the earth, into the cold." The truck's tires screeched against the pavement as I swerved, suddenly aware of the shadows in the fields again. The figures, those shapes, were they real? Or had my mind created them, born from the cold weight of her words? I forced my eyes back to the road, but the sense of something closing in, something watching, made my skin crawl. I could feel it now, the pull of the darkness, the weight of the earth beneath the road, the strange, silent harvest that she spoke of. The girl didn't speak again. She sat motionless beside me, her eyes fixed on the window, her face pale and drained. I could feel her presence like a shadow that clung to me, suffocating the air between us. And then, as the field stretched endlessly into the dark, I saw it. A shape, a figure, moving in the corner of my vision. It was tall, thin, and seemed to flicker in and out of the darkness like a ghost. There was no doubt in my mind that it was one of them, the ones she had spoken of, the harvesters waiting in the fields. I could feel my heart racing, the truck trembling beneath me as I drove faster, desperate to escape, but the road never seemed to end. The darkness stretched on, and no matter how far I went, it felt like I was driving deeper into the grip of something I couldn't escape. And then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, almost inaudible, but growing louder, clearer. The harvest was coming. Story number 5. The Dead Man's Ride. The road stretched ahead, a long, empty ribbon of black asphalt disappearing into the fog. The kind of road that never seemed to end, where every mile felt like it took me farther from everything I knew. The car rumbled beneath me, its tires humming against the pavement as the air outside grew colder, thick with the heaviness of things unsaid. I glanced at the passenger seat where the empty space seemed to press in, suffocating me with its silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I should have felt more, shouldn't I? But the numbness that had settled into my bones since his death hadn't gone away. I couldn't feel anything anymore. It was as if the world outside had slipped away, leaving me alone in this hollow place. The only sound was the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the brakes when I slowed down for a curve. I hadn't expected to stop. I wasn't supposed to be stopping. I should have been on my way, toward the cemetery, toward his grave. But when I saw him, I couldn't help myself. A figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the fog. His coat was dark, the fabric billowing slightly in the wind, as if he belonged to the night itself. His hand was raised, palm open, and before I even realized what I was doing, I was slowing the car to a stop. I rolled down the window a little, the cold air rushing in. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice sounding strange even to me. The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. But when he moved closer, I saw his eyes. Dark, hollow eyes that looked like they had seen too much, too many things that no one should have to see. He climbed in without a word, his movements smooth, almost unnatural. He settled into the seat beside me, and the moment the door clicked shut, the air in the car seemed to grow colder. The silence between us pressed down, thick and suffocating. I should have driven on. I should have asked him to get out, but I didn't. Instead, I turned the key in the ignition and pulled back onto the road. The fog was heavier now, curling around the car like a living thing. The headlights cast strange shadows, bending the world into shapes I didn't recognize. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer at first, and for a moment I thought he hadn't heard me. But then, in the quietest voice, he spoke. "Home," he said, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at him, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. There was something wrong with the way he said it, as if it wasn't just any home he was speaking of, but my home. I turned my eyes back to the road, trying to ignore the cold that was creeping through me, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I forced my eyes forward, but he kept talking. His voice, low and steady, filled the silence between us. "I've seen you before," he said. "Seen you in dreams, in places you shouldn't be. Seen you before your time." I gripped the wheel tighter, the skin of my palms pulling tight against the leather. "I don't know what you mean," I managed, my voice trembling. The fog outside thickened, swallowing everything but the road ahead. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he shifted in his seat, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. It was as though it wasn't just his voice. There was something else in it. Something familiar. Something that made my blood freeze. "You remember him, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft but sure. "You remember the way he looked at you just before you left him behind. You remember the sound of the door closing, the final goodbye, and yet you're still here, still driving to a place you can't reach." I swallowed hard, my throat closing up. The tears that had been threatening to come for days now began to burn in my eyes. His words were too real, too familiar. They dug into the wound I had been trying so hard to ignore. What are you saying?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What do you mean, I'm still here?" The man shifted in his seat, his dark eyes glimmering beneath the brim of his hat. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said, "You never left. You're already dead." I froze, my hand slipping from the steering wheel for a moment before I forced myself to grip it again. The car swerved slightly, the tires screeching against the pavement. "What?" "No," I whispered, my breath coming in short gasps. "That's not possible." He didn't say anything more for a while. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, until I couldn't stand it anymore. "What do you want from me?" I finally demanded. "Why are you saying these things?" He leaned closer, and I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, like something alive, something old. "I want you to see," he said. "I want you to know. The road you're on, the place you're headed, it's not where you think it is. You'll never reach the grave. You're still here, still wandering, waiting for something that will never come." The car felt like it was slowing, like it was no longer moving forward but sinking deeper into the fog, deeper into the space between the living and the dead. "Stop," I choked out, my voice breaking. "Stop talking, please." But he didn't stop. Instead, he leaned even closer, his breath cold against my cheek. "You will never bury him," he whispered, "because you can't bury what's already gone." And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The seat beside me was empty. The air was warmer, the fog thinner. The road ahead still stretched on, but I didn't know where it would take me anymore. I couldn't feel my hands on the wheel. I couldn't feel my heart beating. And I knew, somewhere deep down, that I would never reach his grave. Because I had already passed it. Story number 6. The last stop. The road was endless, stretching out like a vein through the pitch-black night. Nothing but the hum of the tires on asphalt, and the occasional flicker of the dashboard light to remind me I was still moving forward. I hadn't planned to stop, but the storm had picked up, and my gas tank was low. The headlights barely cut through the downpour, and the windshield wipers squeaked against the heavy rain, struggling to keep up. I'd been driving for hours, the steady rhythm of the road lulling me into a tired stupor. My eyes were heavy, and the only thought in my mind was to get to the next town, find a place to rest, and get out of this endless stretch of road. That's when I saw him. A figure standing at the side of the road, soaked through but motionless, his thumb raised in the universal signal for a ride. I pulled over without thinking, the car lurching to a halt, the headlights casting strange shadows on the wet pavement. He didn't look like much, just another lost soul, standing in the rain, waiting. but something about him made me pause. He wasn't just some hitchhiker. He was too still, too quiet, as if he'd been standing there far longer than the rain would suggest. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice sounding loud in the quiet of the storm. He didn't answer at first, just opened the door and slid into the seat beside me, dripping wet, his dark coat heavy with the rain. His face was pale, almost sickly under the dim light of the interior, and his eyes, those eyes, were like deep, empty wells. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation, anything to fill the silence. "The last stop," he replied, his voice low and distant, like it came from somewhere far away. I blinked, not sure if I'd heard him right. "The last stop?" I repeated, trying to make sense of the words. He nodded, his eyes flicking toward me briefly, then back to the dark road ahead. "The last stop," he repeated. "It's where we all end up, where the road ends." I glanced at him, unsure if he was joking or if there was something wrong with him. His tone was flat, almost mechanical. I couldn't tell if he was serious or just mad. "You mean the next town?" I asked, my voice cautious now. He didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His stillness unnerved me, like he was waiting for something, or someone. The silence between us was thick, pressing down on me, and the farther we went, the more uncomfortable I became. The storm outside seemed to intensify, but the road remained eerily quiet. No cars, no lights, just the steady beat of rain against the windshield. The further we drove, the stranger things began to feel. At first, it was subtle. Little things, like the signs on the road disappearing or fading into the darkness as we passed them. Then, the landscape began to change. The trees on either side of the road grew taller, twisted, as though they had been there far longer than they should have been, their branches contorted into unnatural shapes. I glanced at the hitchhiker again. His presence seemed to stretch across the car like an unspoken weight, pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel his eyes, even though I didn't look directly at him. They were always on me, watching, waiting. "I told you," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "This isn't where you think it is. We're already there." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean? This is just a road. We're just driving through a storm." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his fingers twitched, as if he was tracing something in the air, something invisible. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the car was too still, too thick. The sound of the tires on the wet road was the only thing I could hear, but it seemed muffled, as if it came from a long distance away. I turned my gaze back to the road, and that's when I saw it. A sign, faded and barely visible in the dark, standing crooked by the side of the road. The words on it were smeared, but I could make them out. "Last stop." I didn't remember seeing it before, and I certainly hadn't passed it when I'd first picked up the hitchhiker. The sign looked old, too old, like it had been there for decades. The road curved sharply, and as I drove around it, the fog thickened, swirling around the car, swallowing everything in its path. The headlights barely cut through the mist now, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. No turns, no exits, just an endless ribbon of black pavement. The trees on either side of the road had disappeared entirely, replaced by a thick, unnatural fog that clung to the air like smoke. "What the hell is happening?" I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The hitchhiker's voice broke through the fog. "You're in between now," he said quietly, "between life and death. This road doesn't go where you think it does." I didn't want to look at him, but I couldn't help myself. I turned to glance at him, and in that moment I saw it. His eyes weren't just empty. They were black, dark as night, like there was nothing behind them at all. The car swerved slightly as I recoiled from the sight, and when I looked back at the road, everything had changed. The fog was gone, replaced by dark, twisted trees that looked like they were alive. The road itself had shifted, the pavement now cracked and uneven, like the world itself had folded into itself. "You were never meant to leave," the hitchhiker said, his voice almost a whisper. "This is the last stop, and you've already passed the point of no return." The car screeched to a halt, the engine sputtering out as I tried to press the gas. The lights flickered, and I felt the coldness creep into my bones. The hitchhiker smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that stretched across his face, and for the first time, I realized the truth. I was already there. Story number 7. The Banshee's Cry. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, the winding country road stretching out ahead, disappearing into the dense woods that lined either side. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in, thick with a silence so complete it almost felt like the world was holding its breath. The air was sharp, carrying the tang of earth and damp leaves. I had been driving for hours, the isolation of the road sinking deep into my bones. But the silence, that silence, was worse than the loneliness. It was then I saw him, a figure stumbling by the side of the road, his clothes ragged and soaked with rain, his face hidden beneath a mess of dark hair. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he didn't quite belong to this world. I should have passed him by. I should have kept driving, but something made me stop. Something made me pull the car to the side and roll down the window. "You need a ride?" My voice cracked in the quiet, the words seeming to hang in the air too long. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, the shadows curling around him like they were part of him. And when he did move, it was almost too fluid, too smooth, like he was a part of the night itself. Slowly, he climbed into the car, his movements stiff, unnatural, as though the weight of something unseen was dragging him down. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't need to. His presence, his very being, filled the car with a cold that pressed against my skin, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The air seemed to grow heavier the moment he entered, as if the world had shifted in some subtle way that I couldn't quite grasp. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, but he didn't look at me. He stared out the window, his face obscured by his matted hair, his mouth set in a grim line. His silence pressed in on me, unbearable, like a weight on my chest. The only sound in the car was the rain tapping against the glass and the soft hum of the engine. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. Time seemed to stretch, warp, the world outside moving faster than it should. My mind couldn't quite catch up with it. The darkness outside swallowed everything. There were no lights, no houses, just the endless stretch of road cutting through the thick woods. I felt it then, the change in the air. Something was wrong. The car was moving, but I wasn't sure we were still on the same road. Then, in the distance, just on the edge of hearing, I heard it. A wail. A sharp, mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My blood ran cold, the sound was unmistakable. A banshee's wail. I glanced quickly at the man beside me, but he hadn't moved. He hadn't reacted at all, as though he didn't hear the wailing cry tearing through the night. Another wail, this one longer, more desperate. It clawed at my ears, burrowing deep into my chest, filling my lungs with ice. My heart began to race, and I could feel it. The heavy, suffocating weight of dread building inside me. "What? What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling, though I wasn't sure if I was asking him or the night itself. The man remained silent, his eyes still fixed on the window. but as the wailing cry rose again, louder this time, I saw his hand move slightly, curling into a fist at his side. His fingers twitched, his body tensing like a coiled spring, as though he was preparing for something I couldn't understand. Something that was already unfolding. I could feel it now, the presence in the car, pressing in, suffocating, as though the space between us had become too small for both of us to occupy. I wanted to scream, to pull over, to run, but my feet felt frozen to the pedal, my hands glued to the wheel. I could feel the eyes of the man beside me, though I didn't look at him. I could feel them, cold and empty, pressing into my skin. The wail came again, sharp and piercing, tearing through the night. It was closer now. I could feel it in my bones, the sound vibrating through the car like it was coming from the very walls. My head throbbed, and the tears stung my eyes. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst, but the man, he didn't move. He didn't say a word. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't bear the silence, but I could feel his presence closer now, filling the car with an oppressive, suffocating cold. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind, he spoke. "Do you hear it?" His voice was quiet, distant. "She is calling. She has been calling for you." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to ask, I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself. "Who?" I whispered. The man turned slowly toward me, his face now visible through the mess of his hair. His eyes, those eyes were wide, empty, like black pits that swallowed everything around them. He didn't need to answer. I already knew. "The Banshee," he said, his voice low, cold. "She is waiting for you. The call will never stop." The wail came again, louder this time, almost deafening. And in that moment I understood. I wasn't on the road anymore. I wasn't in the world I knew. I was somewhere else, somewhere between life and death, somewhere no one was ever meant to leave. And when I looked back at him, the man was gone. The seat beside me was empty, and the car was driving itself, the engine roaring like thunder as the road twisted and turned, never leading anywhere. The wailing continued, rising up from the darkness, growing louder, until I couldn't hear anything else. And I knew then, without a doubt, that the Banshee had claimed me. There would be no escape. Story number 8. The Bone Collector. The truck rumbled down the empty highway, the engine's hum blending with the rattling of the old chassis. The sky above was a bruised purple, the last of the day's light bleeding away into the desert. There was no wind, only the heat that clung to the earth, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel still, too still. The road stretched out ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that seemed to go on forever, bordered by nothing but dry earth and the occasional lonely cactus. I had been driving for hours, the miles blending together like they always did in the desert. There was no sign of life, no cars, no animals, just the endless expanse of nothing. The heat was oppressive, and the air in the truck was thick, heavy. I wiped the sweat from my brow and kept my eyes on the road. The sound of the tires on the pavement was the only thing keeping me from losing myself in the silence. That's when I saw him. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the dimming light. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, the desert playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, I saw him more clearly. A man, tall and thin, his clothes dirty and torn, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a weathered hat. He raised a hand, a faint, almost mechanical gesture, as if it was the only thing he could do. I slowed the truck and rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice rough from the dry air. The man nodded, and without a word, he climbed into the passenger seat. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was trying not to disturb something. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. He didn't speak, not even as I started the truck and eased back onto the road. For a while, we drove in silence, the truck bouncing over the uneven road. I glanced at the man every now and then, but he just stared out the window, his face still hidden beneath that worn hat. There was something unsettling about the way he didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't make any attempt at small talk. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to speak, or perhaps for the right moment to disappear. Finally, he broke the silence. "You know," he said, his voice low and raspy, "there's bones out there, all over the land, littering the earth in forgotten places." I glanced at him quickly, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his words hanging in the air like dust. "Bones?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. "What do you mean?" "People like you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They come out here thinking they can conquer the land. They think they can drive through it, pass through it without it leaving a mark. But the land doesn't forget, it never forgets. And the bones, they're all that's left of those who dared to cross it." I shifted in my seat, unease creeping up my spine. His words felt wrong, like they were too real, too vivid. "What kind of bones?" I asked, though I didn't want to know. His mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "The bones of those who crossed paths with things they shouldn't have. People who thought they were just passing through, just driving to some faraway place. But they didn't know that the land keeps what it takes. The bones of the dead and the souls." I swallowed, trying to ignore the chill that crawled up my neck. "What do you mean, souls?" He turned slowly, his face now fully visible beneath the hat, and I saw it, those eyes. They were black, deep and endless, like pits that had no bottom. "The bones are just the start," he said softly. "The land takes the soul too, you see, and I collect them, all of them. The bones and the souls of those who wander too far." The truck swerved slightly and I gripped the wheel harder, my pulse quickening. I didn't want to look at him, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. His presence in the truck was like a weight, something pressing in on me from all sides, making it harder to breathe. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. The man smiled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a smile, it was a grin, wide and jagged, like something that had been carved into his face. "I'm the one who takes what the land claims," he said, his voice a rasp. "I take the bones, and I take the souls, and you, my friend, are next." I slammed my foot on the brake, the truck jerking to a halt. The tires squealed against the dry earth, and the sound seemed to echo out into the desert, lost to the wind. The man didn't flinch, he didn't move. He just sat there, his dark eyes fixed on me. I opened the door to get out, but the truck wouldn't budge. The engine sputtered, died, and the headlights flickered once before going out completely. The world outside the truck was pitch black, the desert swallowed up by an unnatural darkness. I tried to open the door again, but it wouldn't budge. I turned to the man, and in that moment I saw something behind his eyes. Something ancient, something terrible. "You can't leave," he whispered. "Not now. The land has already taken you." The truck was still. The air was still. But in the distance I heard something faint, distant, like a low rumble that echoed through the earth itself. And then I realized what it was. The sound of bones, rattling beneath the ground, waiting for the next soul to cross their path. The man reached into his coat, his fingers slow and deliberate, and pulled something from inside, a small, worn bag. He opened it, and the faintest glint of something caught the light. Bones. hundreds of them. They were all there, rattling in his hand, and I felt the weight of them, the pull of them. "You're mine now," he said, and his grin widened. The last thing I saw was the gleam of his dark eyes, and then everything went black, and somewhere beneath the earth the bones were waiting, rattling once more. Story number 9. The empty highway. The road stretched out ahead, a never-ending ribbon of cracked asphalt under a sky heavy with dusk. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something that felt like decay. It was the kind of highway that seemed to go on forever, the kind that swallowed everything in its path, leaving nothing but the feeling of being lost, even when you knew exactly where you were. I'd been driving for hours, and the isolation of the road was starting to weigh on me, each mile more oppressive than the last. The headlights barely cut through the darkening stretch of road ahead. The radio had long gone silent, and the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt, that steady, monotonous rhythm that was starting to lull me into a kind of daze. That's when I saw her, a figure stumbling by the side of the road, her silhouette barely visible in the faint glow of the headlights. I slowed the car, then stopped. It didn't make sense to pull over, but something in me couldn't drive past her. Something told me I had no choice. She was barefoot, her skin pale and streaked with dirt, her clothes torn and clinging to her in a way that made it clear she'd been walking for far longer than she should have. Her eyes were wide, desperate. There was a kind of panic in the way she moved, stumbling toward the car, hands outstretched, begging for help. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. "Do you need a ride?" She didn't speak at first. She just stood there, staring at me, her eyes flicking between me and the empty road behind her. There was something strange about her gaze. Too intense, too frantic. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. Please help me. I need to get away." I opened the door for her. She didn't hesitate. She climbed in quickly, her eyes never leaving the road, her hands trembling in her lap. The moment she sat down, the air in the car grew colder. The kind of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a kind of chill that settled deep into your bones, making you feel watched. But I didn't say anything. I just put the car in drive and began to pull away. We drove in silence for a while. She didn't speak again. She just stared out the window, her face pale, and her eyes darting around like she was looking for something, waiting for something to happen. I wanted to ask her what happened, what she was running from, but I didn't. There was something in the air that kept me from speaking. As we drove further into the night, I began to notice things. Little things at first. The way her face seemed to change when I glanced at her. Subtle shifts, like her expression was never quite the same. It wasn't dramatic, not enough to make me question it at first, but there was something about her that didn't sit right. Her features flickered, like shadows playing tricks on my mind. I looked away from her, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the longer we drove, the more I noticed. The trees lining the side of the highway were too still, too silent. Their branches seemed to stretch just a little too far over the road, leaning in closer, as though they were watching us, waiting. The trees weren't supposed to look like that. No trees ever did. They were too dark, too twisted, and as we passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in, moving toward the car, as if the road was shrinking, the world around us closing tighter with each passing mile. I glanced at the woman beside me again. Her face was different now, more drawn, as though the weight of something had settled deeper into her skin. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear anymore, more like resignation. She had a kind of blankness about her now, as though whatever was happening was beyond her control, beyond mine. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice uneasy. The road ahead seemed endless, the landscape stretching on in all directions. There were no signs, no lights, no other cars. The highway felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be here. She turned to me then, and when she looked at me, I saw it. Her eyes weren't just wide, they were empty. Hollow, black, and endless, like there was nothing behind them. Like she wasn't really there at all. "We're already there," she whispered. I didn't understand. I turned my gaze back to the road, but everything felt wrong. The trees were closer now, the darkness thicker. The road, it seemed, was looping back on itself. The same patches of asphalt passed by again, the same broken signs that I thought I'd already seen. The road never ended. I'd seen that stretch of black pavement before, hadn't I? And yet it stretched out before me, stretching farther and farther into the night. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes drifted back to the window, and for the first time, I saw it. The edge of the road was curling, the pavement bending like a twisted ribbon. The trees on either side were leaning in, closer now, so close that the cars seemed to be driving through them, like the road was winding into some other place, some other world. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It kept moving forward, the engine roaring in protest, but the car was no longer mine. The steering wheel was too cold to touch, and the road was no longer a road. It was something else, something darker. The woman's voice filled the silence again, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting. "We're not going anywhere," she said, her voice now echoing in the car, distant and hollow. "The road never ends, not for us." And as the world around me folded into itself, the trees closed in, the darkness pressed against the windows, and the car kept moving forward, I realized there was no escape. We were already gone. Story number 10. The Sleepless Highwayman. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching out before me like a black snake, winding endlessly through the darkness. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised with twilight, and I was too tired to keep my eyes open for more than a few seconds at a time. The headlights flickered occasionally, their beam barely cutting through the thickening fog. My eyelids were heavy, and I could feel my grip on the steering wheel slipping, my body betraying me with each passing mile. That's when I saw him. A figure by the side of the road, standing perfectly still. His silhouette was sharp against the emptiness, and for a moment I thought I imagined him. Just another mirage in the dark. But he didn't disappear, he didn't move either, but when I slowed down he stepped toward the car. I rolled down the window just a crack, unsure of what to say. My voice felt thick, stuck in my throat. "You need a ride?" The man didn't answer right away. His eyes, those bright, unnervingly sharp eyes, stared at me from beneath the shadow of his cap. They were too wide, too awake, like they'd never once closed in the years he'd walked the earth. There was no trace of exhaustion in his gaze, no sign of weariness. I couldn't help but feel that he was somehow older than he seemed, like the weight of time was nothing more than an illusion to him. "I'm heading to the next town," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm for the dead of night. "It's a long road. You look like you need a rest." I hesitated, my body aching with the exhaustion I hadn't realized was consuming me. He was right. I needed sleep. But something about him, about his eyes, made my stomach twist. I couldn't place it. Something was off. "All right," I finally said, "hop in." He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, settling in as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. I couldn't help but notice how still he was, how perfectly calm, like a mannequin someone had placed in the seat. There was no shift, no sound of movement, only the faintest sigh of the air conditioning fighting against the heat of the night. The silence in the car grew thick, heavy, and I realized I was staring at him, unable to look away. The highway stretched out in front of us, endless and black. I tried to break the silence. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, glancing over at him. "Wherever the road takes me," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But I don't think it'll take you anywhere, not if you keep driving." I swallowed, unsettled by the cryptic nature of his words. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "People stop here, but they never leave," he continued, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. His voice was smooth, almost hypnotic. "They think they're just passing through, but that's not how it works. Not here." I shook my head, trying to ignore the way his words made my skin crawl. "It's just a road," I muttered. "I'm just getting to the next town." "You think it's a road," he said, his voice a whisper now, like the air itself was holding its breath. "But it's not really." The world outside the car seemed to shrink in on itself. The trees on the side of the road leaned closer, their branches creeping toward the headlights, stretching long and twisted, as though they were reaching for something. I focused on the road, gripping the steering wheel harder, trying to push away the sense of dread creeping into my bones. I could feel his presence pressing in on me like something heavy, suffocating. "I've been driving for so long," I said, trying to make conversation, though my voice felt strained. "I can't even remember when I started, or why." "That's because it doesn't matter," he replied, his voice strangely detached. "You're here now, and you'll keep driving, keep going, until you realize it's too late to stop." The air in the car seemed to grow colder, the chill creeping into my skin like a sickness. I glanced at him again, and this time I saw it. His eyes weren't just bright, they were unnaturally bright, glowing almost, like the headlights had been reflected in them too long. They were wide, unblinking, as though they were sucking the light out of the car, pulling it into themselves. I turned my attention back to the road, but I could feel it then. Something wasn't right. The trees on the side of the road weren't just leaning closer, they were growing, stretching, their trunks twisting like they were alive. The pavement beneath the tires had started to ripple, like waves in the ocean, shifting in subtle ways that I couldn't quite understand. The road seemed to bend in ways it shouldn't, curving at odd angles, as if it was no longer a road at all. "How long have you been driving?" the man asked suddenly, his voice sharp now, cutting through the tension. "How many miles have you gone? Do you know?" I tried to answer, but my throat felt tight. I looked at the dashboard. The numbers on the odometer had stopped moving, frozen at a number I couldn't quite read. My hands were shaking now, gripping the wheel harder, but it didn't stop the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching. "You'll never leave," he whispered, and I could hear the smile in his voice now. It was stretched, twisted, as though it wasn't meant to be a smile at all. "Not unless you want to." I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. The world outside the windows was a blur of shadow and light, and the road kept twisting, folding in on itself like it was looping endlessly. The headlights flickered, and the man beside me didn't move. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked onto mine, and I could feel them pulling me in, dragging me deeper into the nightmare he had created. And I realized, in that moment, that he wasn't just a hitchhiker. He was a part of the road itself, a part of something that didn't end. Not now, not ever. The road never ends, and neither will I.